Welcome to Stop the Noise, where small business specialists cut through the clutter to hone in on practical things small business owners can do to solve business challenges and move their business forward. Hosts Brenda Thompson and Martin Katak from Finance for Business are talking with Janine Purdy from Business Credit Solutions and Sophie Inwood from QR Lawyers about how to stop unpaid invoices killing your business. So my first question to get started is, how big is the unpaid invoice problem for small businesses in Australia? Janine, do you want to roll with that one?
Thanks, Brenda. Yes, it's a $26 billion problem in Australia in unpaid invoices, and that consumes 18 million hours per year. So you can imagine the cost.
And I'm guessing that small businesses, when they're looking at an unpaid invoice, aren't actually looking at things like the hours that go into chasing and collection, or the cost of the money, having the money tied up. They're probably, are we willing to bet, and Martin, you might, or Sophie, you might want to contribute to this, they're probably just looking at, I'm owed 50,000 and not all the other implications of that cost. Are those implications wrapped up in those numbers you just said, or is that just the outstanding debt?
I believe it would be wrapped up in. No, I think that is actually
just
the
probably
unpaid
just the outstanding
invoices.
debt. Yeah, Martin, your thoughts on that one? Because you look at working capital all the time.
I understand that, particularly from the small businesses, while we talk about the dollar value, there's an emotional cost that's paid in the business. The pain they feel from not being paid, they feel abused, and from a staff point of view, someone who's trying to collect that debt gets upset and emotional, trying to get people to get paid. So I think if we measure it, it's not only a dollar cost, and I'm a dollar person, but it's also emotional cost and a stress within the business, and that can really show on small businesses when the cash is tight and the stress about trying to collect outstanding debts.
Sleepless nights affect productivity during the day as well.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the sense of relationship cost too for in a small business, the owner and his relationship with those clients who aren't paying, and that sense of, oh, I don't want to damage the relationship by chasing. Which probably leads on to my next question about why you think that the problem is so big. Sophie, do you want to lead off with that?
Yeah, sure. I think the government was actually very good in initially addressing what was a huge economic shock by putting in a huge amount of relief, and that saw businesses able to survive for a long period. But I think that has now certainly come to an end, and we're going to, as we were discussing just before we got on the call, that's come to an end, and we're going to see in the next few months, I guess, the impact in real terms, and that will lead to a huge amount of, I believe, debt recovery, a huge amount of corporate insolvencies, which will follow just because of the financial stress and pressure that's placed on businesses as other businesses start to call in their debts.
So really what you're talking about there is the very significant implications of what's happened with COVID and the government relief.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's still in some ways a little bit unknown. Because people, it's only starting to come now. It's people are starting to call in those debts, and the relief has obviously stopped. So the pressure and the stress is really starting to show now, and it'll be, I guess, crunch time in the next sort of 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. Janine, have you seen particular industry sectors that have been more significantly impacted, or that have a bigger debt collection problem than others?
Certainly an increase in construction. Debt over the last, or since January, and some big debts there too. Lots of people who have never had problems before, it's all coming out now, and there's lots of stress.
Martin, before we started the call, you were talking about some of the issues you've seen. Did you want to contribute to that question?
Well, construction sort of got a perfect storm. It got a compulsory lockdown that it wasn't geared up for. Unlike other businesses that did, it wasn't ready for it. And most building contracts are fixed price, raw materials and so forth. The costs have risen, so anyone who's building anything is really, you know, as we can see with ProBuild, is caught in the middle. And if there's, you know, there's no cash to go around, we see these sort of failures.
And there'd be a huge amount of roll-on effect from those kinds of things into all the associated trades, yeah?
I also think
definitely.
events and sporting, they were hugely impacted, and it's become really important for businesses to understand what sort of refund and cancellation terms they have within their documents, or just that they're required to provide to consumers.
Okay, so just before we dive into the checklist, I'd love your perspectives, possibly both of you, perhaps Janine and Sophie, like excluding the COVID problem, because let's face it, small business debt has always been a big problem. What do you think the causes of that problem are? Why does it happen?
Well, I think people just aren't prepared, and it's a bit touch wood. I've seen people with fantastic businesses for 40 years that have been very lucky, and then it can be the roll-on effect of you know, them not getting paid and the consequences there. They just didn't have the right paperwork, and Sophie will talk about that. It just happened when they least were prepared for it, and they just didn't have lots of processes in place that could have been done a whole lot better.
So all about the business who issued the invoice having all the right systems and processes in place in the first place. And I guess the other side of that then comes from the businesses not having the money to pay, which has been so much worsened by the COVID situation. That sort of sum it up?
Yeah, and just knowledge of who you're dealing with, because so many people really don't know enough information and credit history of who they're dealing with.
Yeah, which I think is going to lead us beautifully into the checklist at the moment. But before we go there, Sophie or Martin, did you want to add anything to that overview?
I was just going to say that I think people are very time poor, and they aren't aware that they could outsource that to Janine. So it's easier, well, unless they're aware that, you know, there are organisations like Janine's that can take that on. I think it's a lot of the time they just write it off because it's easier to focus on the next big job as opposed to calling in the fee for the last one.
Without thinking about all those massive on costs that go with it, Martin.
Yeah, look, there are two things I'd like to add there. Firstly, using someone like Janine outsources the problem, but also stops the relationship issues. Because many, you know, as you mentioned earlier, that the business has a relationship with the debtor and they want to manage that carefully. If you move it to a third party, someone like Janine, well, then that relationship isn't as threatened, and it's easier and can be managed better than what it could be if you were dealing with it yourself. And the other thing that I'd like to point out is that when you look at a business and you look at its creditors, they're in fact its free bank. You see, if you can, you know, everyone needs working capital, and if you manage not to pay your creditors, you're borrowing money for nothing. So there's no cheaper interest rate than that. So when you're a small business and you have debtors, right, you've got to consider that you're acting as their bank and manage them, because what you're doing is giving your creditors are giving you, and your debtors, you're providing them free money. So that's a way of looking at it. And, you know, some ruthless business people realize this and say, well, I have to pay interest to the bank. I don't have to pay interest to my creditors.
Well, so if you don't want to be an interest-free bank to your customers, let's get stuck into the checklist. Now it's time to dig into the 10 things you can implement right away to minimize the risk of unpaid invoices sucking up your working capital. To access the full webinar and download the checklist, click the Get Free Access button directly beneath this video.